Now I have a question for you today. Do you have anybody that you know that you would consider to be a second-class citizen? Would it be the Republican next door or the Democrat on the other side? Or would it be perhaps the kid in the neighborhood that's kind of an obnoxious little brat? Or would it be somebody you know that has AIDS, or perhaps somebody who's gay, and you consider them to be second class because of their particular choices they've made? What about the other individuals in town, the drunk perhaps, or maybe the Mexican down the street who doesn't speak English very well, or perhaps the black family in your street? Perhaps it's somebody who you don't trust in your neighborhood. There's always somebody, either in our family or in our neighborhood, that we look upon as being perhaps second class, for one reason or another. Some prejudice, perhaps, some bigotry, perhaps some thing that they have done in their life that we would consider a sin that's greater than any we have done. Well, I want to read this passage today because it addresses that topic somewhat. We're starting in Mark chapter 1 and verse 40. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. Jesus sent away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing, as a testimony to them." Indeed, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. Leprosy is not something we face very often in our world today. Occasionally we hear about it in some third world country perhaps, or our occasional lepers even in our country, but it's rather kind of rare. The term used here that's most often translated as leprosy actually is a little bit broader than our term today. It's not necessarily the medical term for Hansen's disease as we would know it, but it would include people who maybe have a skin rash or even a severe case of acne. And so the term there is a little bit broader, and there may be some in that community that just had acne. I know when I was in high school, some of you remember what it was like in high school. There was always that kid that seemed to have a pockmark every inch on his face that, just seemed to be covered in it. And sometimes, as high school is, it's a very cruel environment for some strange reason. People are too immature to understand how much their words can really severely injure another person's life. And so people pick on others like that. Perhaps today we discriminate against people for all kinds of different reasons. Perhaps in our choices. Perhaps even we discriminate against other Christians because they have choices that they have made that are different than the choices we have. And so we look down upon our nose upon them. We look upon them as being perhaps second-class Christians because they haven't quite measured up to our self-righteous standards. And so what people in our lives would we consider to be leprous, unclean? In the Old Testament time, the people with skin rashes or skin problems had to present themselves to the priest, and the priest would make a decision as to whether that person should be put out of the camp or not. And so they were quarantined until the priest would declare them clean again. And yet Jesus did not take that particular law into consideration in his dealing with people. Sometimes we are so concerned about law and not enough concerned about people. And yet Jesus turned that around, showing that he was more concerned about people than picking rules. After all, he was the one who inspired them in the first place. And the leprosy gentleman came to him and begged him on his knees and said, "If you are willing." Now, I've been in certain Christian circles where healing is misunderstood to some extent. People think that if you're not healed, you perhaps sinned. Or if you're not healed, you just don't have enough faith. And yet, if we look at the totality of the healings throughout the Bible, we'll see that sometimes God intervenes and heals a nation 400 years later, after they've gone into Egypt, as He did with ancient Israel. And sometimes not at all, even in this life, as He did with St. Paul, where Paul had some kind of affliction. We can speculate, and a lot of people guess that may have been his eyesight that was failing. And yet God told him, "My grace is sufficient for you." In effect saying, you can wait for your healing in the next life. And so sometimes we see people who are healed today. I've seen people healed immediately, like this gentleman was. I've seen people healed over time. And I've seen people that God has apparently told, not in this life. And yet healing is something that sometimes we misunderstand in the church. And so he went to Jesus with I think a good understanding, saying here, "If you are willing." As Jesus Himself said, when He asked that this cup pass, He said, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And of course, we know what the Lord's answer was there. And so He said, "You can make me clean." He said, "You can make me clean." He knew that Jesus had the ability. Apparently the priests didn't have that ability, or weren't willing, or didn't have the faith, or didn't believe, or didn't even practice that. I'm not sure which. But notice it says here that Jesus was filled with compassion. When someone's ostracized from the community, from the neighborhood, from the church, because they're a little different than we, are we filled with compassion for them, or are we filled with bigotry towards them? Are we filled with love towards them, or are we filled with hate towards them? We may not agree with certain lifestyles in the community. That gives us no excuse not to show love. We may not agree with certain political views. That gives us no excuse not to show love. And so the drunk down the street, or the homosexual next door, deserves just as much our love as anybody else. Because in heaven there is no such thing as a second-class citizen. In the community of believers, we're all one. There's no Mr. Billionaire versus common Joe Blow. We're all the same. We're all equal. In a community where I grew up, if you called somebody Mr., it meant you didn't like him. Which I thought was kind of funny. You showed respect to people by calling them by their first name. In the community where I grew up, and then if you didn't like somebody, you called him Mr. Smith, which was kind of a sneaky way of being polite. But how are we towards our neighbors? Do we show them respect from our heart? It doesn't matter what titles we give them or not. Sometimes we can give people titles, but show them disrespect. And sometimes we can call them by their first name and show them utter respect. It depends on what's in our heart that's really important. And Jesus was filled with compassion. The word compassion here is really hard to translate. Oftentimes it's called compassion when it's translated. Sometimes it's called indignity. Because Jesus was actually angry compassionate.